Hello, this is Aaron, and welcome back to the podcast. I hope that everyone had a great weekend. Fall has arrived here in Indianapolis. We went from high temperatures in the 90s to down in the 60s or low 70s almost overnight. It feels great here. I'm back in long pants and long sleeve shirts. Love the fall weather. The fall in the Midwest is incredibly beautiful. So I hope the weather is good wherever you might be. I actually preempted a podcast that I wanted to give today in order to respond to headlines that I have been seeing about the protest in Iran, which are really starting to get really positive feedback from the American media. And I just wanted to shed a little insight on how we should think about the media's reporting on foreign countries and on events in foreign countries. A lot of conservatives think the media's leftist, therefore the media opposes whatever it is Republicans or conservatives want to do. And this is often applied to foreign policy and security policy as well. If we think back to, say, Vietnam, I don't remember Vietnam, but there's this sort of myth about Vietnam that the media was exposing how things were really going in Vietnam, that the government was lying, it was covering things up, it was covering up atrocities, it was covering up that the war was not going well, and these plucky reporters go and expose the truth, that the media was really holding the U.S. government to account on Vietnam. Moving into the 80s and the Reagan era, which I do remember, the general belief among conservatives would have been that the media was very dovish towards the Soviet Union, that the media favored détente. They did not like the buildup of the military and nuclear weapons and Star Wars and all of that under Ronald Reagan. That they were weak on communist paramilitaries and communist governments in Central America, other places. And in essence, the media was very negative towards this. Similarly, I think there's a belief that the media was very negative towards Iraq and towards the Bush administration in Iraq, that they're trying to uncover how things are going, et cetera. So this is a belief system that I think many conservatives have. And in reality, while there is some elements of truth in that, we should best see the media when it comes to matters of foreign policy and other countries as reflecting the preferences and policy goals of the U.S. government, which is incredibly bipartisan in nature. There is a great deal of consensus around essentially what we might label neoconservative, foreign policy. You don't have to call it neoconservative. That's probably not a totally accurate label, but it can help us think about it in our mind because I don't have a better one right here. But I would say the media is very pro-government. The media is going to tell the story about other countries largely in the way that the U.S. foreign policy and security establishment wants that story to be told. So let's go back to the Iraq War, 2002, 2003, the lead up to the war. The truth is that the media was actually pretty favorable to that war in a lot of ways. The media was reporting about WMDs in Iraq at that time. For example, they were backing up a lot of things that was going on. I happened to work at the Manhattan Institute with Judy Miller, who was the New York Times reporter who was probably the only person in the media fired over the Iraq War. She's a neocon. She would probably embrace that label, actually. And so they were probably looking maybe to get rid of her because she might have been viewed as too conservative. But yeah, New York Times reported that there were WMDs in Iraq. Now, I do have to say, there is this view that's very popular in the dissident community that the media just flat out lied. that everybody was just lying about WMDs in Iraq. Everybody knew there were no WMDs in Iraq there. Well, except David French. David French still maintains that we actually did find WMDs in Iraq, and therefore the rationale for the war was true because there were a few leftover shells of whatever that we found there. But everybody else now admits there were no WMDs in Iraq. I don't believe that certainly the media was lying. Maybe there were people in the U.S. government who knew they were overstating the case, but I certainly don't believe Judy Miller was concocting her stories by any means. I got to tell you a Judy Miller story, actually. When I started the Manhattan Institute, I put out my very first research report, which was about brain gain in different cities. And it turns out that there was an error in the data in my report. And I don't want to get too down in the weeds, but I had a database. I checked it 6 different ways from Sunday. I even manually recalculated some of these figures in order to do a desk check to make sure the calculations were going right. I feel like I really did great quality assurance. But when I had run this calculation, I had not realized that it had new data in it, that if the old value was still there, it just kept the old cached value. It didn't recalculate the new value. And this was only a problem for metropolitan regions that had been redefined during a certain period. And it just so happened that all of the ones that I had manually checked were ones that had not been redefined. So there were a couple of them, like Grand Rapids, that were wrong. And of course, you just get this job at this think tank, which is almost like your dream job at the time. You're moving to New York, what you wanted to do. You have an error in your very first paper. You're not coming at this from a PhD background. So pretty much everybody in the think tank business has a PhD, often from Ivy League institutions. I'm probably the only person there in a senior fellow role who doesn't have a graduate degree, and I end up having an error in my very first paper. And so this is enormously stress-inducing. Fortunately for me, it did not cause any material changes to the results of the paper. The arguments I would made were all still true. I had to correct some of the specific data, which was embarrassing, but nevertheless I did it. So I'm standing in the break room, and obviously I'm just looking enormously stressed, and in walks Judy Miller. And I didn't really know who Judy Miller was at the time. Basically, really, I didn't. She sat 2 doors down from me. I didn't know who she was, really. I didn't know she was Judy Miller. I mean, I knew her name and all that, but I didn't know the whole background on her, that she'd been the person at the New York Times who'd written this WMD in Iraq reporting. And she obviously saw that I was, looking very stressed in my face. She's like, "Oh, how are things going?" And I'm like, "Well, just told her." I said, "Well, my very first paper, I have this data error." She's like, "Well, all you can do is correct it." And if I'd known at the time, like who I was talking to there, was there. And so, all you can do, by the way, when you make a mistake, which everybody's going to make a mistake, you have to own it. You have to correct it. And that doesn't mean that, you're not going to get, punished over that. You're not going to have a problem, but it's certainly far better off to own up to it in almost every case than to try to paper it over and hope nobody finds out. And again, as I got to know Judy and saw her reporting there, I paid attention to the writing she would do, even on matters. She was very negative on Trump, really a never Trumper, hated Trump. And yet I'd read the reporting she did on Trump and other things. And I'm like, well, everything that I see here looks like it's well reported, well sourced. She's not going beyond where there's real data into some of these loony conspiracy theories that other people were doing. I didn't see her purporting this idea that, yes, there really is a P tape of Donald Trump in a hotel somewhere. So my belief is that, she, made an honest error, probably because she was overly dependent on these U.S. government sources. She doesn't have access to the raw intelligence. She's not over there. And because when it comes to foreign policy, most of us really have absolutely no clue about these other countries. The government really has a lot of leverage to shape how the media covers things. I think his name was Ben Rhodes, worked in the Obama administration. He mocked in a New York Times magazine profile of him about how the average staff, media person in D.C. is 27 years old, knows absolutely nothing, right? It's like, well, we just manipulate them. basically. And it used to be that even sort of regional newspapers used to have a lot of overseas bureau with foreign correspondents everywhere, and they really knew things. Now the Times has foreign correspondents, but there are fewer foreign correspondents than there used to be. And even the Times, heavily dependent on access to government information. And I think every journalist knows, okay, I have to have these government sources in order to do my job. But if I'm too negative, then they'll cut me off. I can't do my job. So how do I navigate that? And it's a legitimate challenge to navigate. Let's be clear here. If any of us were in that, it would be a challenge. So anyhow, the reality is that the government has been, the media tends to be very initially, at least, positive towards the U.S. government. The media, my understanding, was actually very positive on Vietnam for a very long time. And this is the argument put forth by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky in their 1988 book, Manufacturing Consent. The title comes from Walter Lippmann's Public Opinion from the 20s, where he talks about the manufacture of consent. And basically, in the Herman and Chomsky model, what we see is their views. They call it the propaganda model, or the propaganda lens. And their basically view is sort of here's kind of a leftist spin on the media. They basically say, look, it's big corporations. All the media companies are big corporations. They're dependent for their revenue on big advertisers, and therefore they go along with what the establishment wants. And so they sort of view them as very corporate. They represent corporate interest, but they put a very different spin on it. So I'll just read you a couple quotes from Chomsky here. This one might be from the intro to one of their books. This might not be from the original. It is our view that among their other functions, the media serve and propagandize on behalf of the powerful societal interests that control and finance them. The representatives of these interests have important agendas and principles that they want to advance, and they are well positioned to shape and constrain media policy. This is normally not accomplished by crude intervention, but by the selection of right-thinking personnel and by the editors and working journalists' internalization of priorities and definitions of newsworthiness that conform to the institution's policies. Here's another quote. The essential ingredients of our propaganda model, or set of news filters, fall under the following headings. 1, the size, concentrated ownership, owner wealth, and profit orientation of the dominant mass media firms. 2, advertising is the primary income source of the mass media. 3, the reliance of the media on information provided by government, business, and experts funded and approved by these primary sources and agents of power. 4, flack as a means of disciplining the media. And 5, anti-communism as a national religion and control mechanism. These elements interact with and reinforce one another. The raw material of news must pass through successive filters, leaving only the cleansed residue fit to print. They fix the premises of discourse and interpretation and the definition of what is newsworthy in the first place, and they explain the basis and operations of what amounts to propaganda campaigns. And they also get at something that I like to highlight, which is that America is not really a capitalist system anymore. We used to talk about, America is the free market. Other countries are, they're communist or they're socialist or they're much more state-directed. So we think of this when it comes to the healthcare system. We don't want to have socialized medicine. Canada has socialized medicine. Look at their problem. Look at these other countries. We want to be able to have it just between us and our doctors. Well, in fact, we have a form of socialized medicine here. We have, rather than direct state ownership of the means of production or direct state control over these industries, we have the public-private partnership model, which in many ways has the worst elements of a state-owned system with the worst elements of the private-owned system, where you have sort of rent-seeking, regulatory capture, et cetera. So the federal government pays for over half of healthcare expenses in the United States of America. Everything is regulated 6 days from Sunday. If anybody who's had to go in a hospital or deal with anything today knows, it's really not between you and your doctor. It's between you and your doctor on the one hand and the insurance companies on the other, which are all micromanaged by the state. So this idea that we actually have a private system in most domains of American business is simply not true. It's an incomplete model. And they get at this when it comes to the media. The media is not state-owned media like we have in other countries. It's a public-private partnership model. Here's what Herman and Chomsky say. In countries where the levels of power are in the hands of a state bureaucracy, the monopolistic control over the media, often supplemented by official censorship, makes it clear that the media serve the ends of a dominant elite. It is much more difficult to see a propaganda system at work where the media are private and formal censorship is absent. And he's also like, look, the media is not a monolith here. It's not like every single thing is propaganda and that all facts are covered up, etc. So they give a few perspectives on that. The mass media are not a solid monolith on all issues. Where the powerful are in disagreement, there will be a certain diversity of tactical judgments on how to attain generally shared aims reflected in media debate. But views that challenge fundamental premises or suggest that the observed modes of exercise of state power are based on systemic factors will be excluded from the mass media, even when elite controversy over tactics rages fiercely. Another, that the media provides some facts about an issue, however, proves absolutely nothing about the adequacy or accuracy of that coverage. The mass media do, in fact, literally suppress a great deal, as we will describe in the chapters that follow. But even more important in this context is the question of the attention given to a fact, its placement, tone, and repetitions, the framework of analysis within which it is presented, and the related facts that accompany it and give it meaning or preclude understanding. That a careful reader looking for a fact can sometimes find it with diligence and a skeptical eye tells us nothing about whether that fact received the attention and context it deserved, whether it was intelligible to the reader or effectively distorted or suppressed. What level of attention it deserved may be debatable, but there is no merit to the pretense that because certain facts may be found in the media by a diligent and skeptical researcher, the absence of radical bias and the de facto suppression is thereby demonstrated. So those are some quotes from Chomsky. Again, I think his model is a little overly reductionist. I also don't think that the corporate control model is something that really resonates today. But his idea that the government basically reps, the elite consensus line in America is very powerful. Now, I should say I don't necessarily suggest reading this book because about 80% of it is hyper-minute analyses of things most people here don't know much about. The book was written in the 80s, so it focuses a lot on Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. It also talks a lot about Vietnam. So probably a lot of my listeners don't really remember much about those things. I mean, I was a kid in the 80s, a teenager. I remember watching this stuff on TV about Central America, so I found it very interesting to have different perspectives on it. But again, if you don't know that, probably it won't make a lot of sense to you. It may be too much. My eyes kind of glazed over during a lot of it. It's also the case that these guys clearly, have a pro-left sympathy. If you look at, their treatment of, say, Daniel Ortega and his regime in Nicaragua, very, very favorable. He's basically presented as if he's some, high-minded European social democrat. I don't think that's the case then. I don't think it's the case today either, by the way. So they're overstating their case. But nevertheless, this idea, is one that I think we should keep in mind. And I wanted to highlight this with regards to Iran, but also especially with regards to the Ukraine war. I subscribe to the Wall Street Journal, and I get the daily paper and try to read it. And I started noticing when Russia invaded Ukraine that all of the media coverage was put forth in a way that was very pro-Ukraine. Not in the sense that, we want Ukraine to win and Russia to lose, which is certainly like a legitimate sentiment, that many of us might agree with, but essentially that all the news was framed in a way that makes the outcomes or what's happening appear very favorable to Zelensky and to, Ukraine. Ukraine's always winning the war. It's always a disaster for Russia, etc. And one Saturday, I remember I got the paper, and it said something to the effect of, Ukraine to retake all territory, Russia has invaded, Ukraine says. So the headline on the front page was literally sourced to nothing more than Ukraine says. And if you actually read these articles, what you see is a lot of them are literally sourced to nothing more than that. Ukraine says this, ergo we're writing an article that basically just reps whatever Zelensky's government has said. And there's essentially no skeptical reporting on it whatsoever. And so when I tweeted this thing, I said, look, I have absolutely no idea what's actually going on in Ukraine. Very obviously, Russia did not have some massive shock and awe victory that some had predicted it might have. So from that perspective, things had not gone well for Russia. But otherwise, I just don't know. But I am pretty sure that if things were going as well for Ukraine as I read every single day in the newspaper, the Russians would have hightailed it back to Moscow a long time ago. And so that's what we see. Every day in the Wall Street Journal, relentless 98% positive coverage of Ukraine. And this is 100% completely aligned with the policy positions of the U.S. government with regards to Russia and Ukraine. If you just knew that these guys are repping the company line, you could probably have come up with the idea, yeah, this is about 80% of the headlines. This is what we would expect to have happened. And again, it's very obvious that the reporting is incredibly thinly sourced and often transparently so. I mean, literally their headline just said, Ukraine says, as if that's supposed to be good enough for a story about a war. If I wrote an article called Russia Says, people would say, you're a disinformation artist, you're competing Russian propaganda. But that's what our media does on Ukraine every day. So literally, I stopped reading articles about Ukraine. I don't read any articles about Ukraine in any media outlets in the United States because I simply don't believe that they are giving me a fair assessment of what's going on there. They say, well, what is going on there? I don't know. I have no clue what's going on in Ukraine. Apparently, we'll find out at some future point how this plays out. But right now, I don't believe that the U.S. media are providing any materially fair and accurate reporting when it comes to Ukraine. That doesn't mean every single thing they're telling you is factually incorrect. But in the Chomsky model here, which I think is very accurate looking at this, all of the reporting on Ukraine is shaped to promote a narrative that aligns very closely with that of the U.S. government and the bipartisan policy consensus. Doesn't mean, I don't like to use the term propaganda. That's just a little overly, pejorative. I just want to stick to the observed facts. I mean, just observed factually, this is how they're reporting. And that doesn't mean that the desires of the elite are necessarily wrong. I'm not taking a judgment on that. I'm just saying that the reporting, we cannot rely on the reporting towards this country. Similarly, let's look at Iran. We're getting all these glowing reports. Oh, the women are, taking off their hijabs and protests. Now, of course, the media was talking about how the hijab was a symbol of freedom not that long ago. I'm seeing people tweet all the art articles talking about how awesome the hijab is. Well, now the hijab's out because these guys are doing it. It's like they turn on a dime. And I remember a few years back, there were a bunch of protests in Iran. It's like, oh, Twitter is going to help us overthrow the Iranian government. The Iranian government might fall. Well, who knows? Maybe the Iranian government will fall. But I do know this. Iran has been an enemy of the United States since the 1970s. And because they're an enemy of the United States, our media reporting on Iran is going to reflect that of an enemy. So we are not going to get any fair or accurate reporting about Iran or the nature of those protests or what is going on. Now, it doesn't mean that in every single country or every single element of foreign policy, this is how it works. When there's not necessarily some stake, of the government in something, there's often interesting, accurate articles. Sometimes I read articles that seem very informative. Again, there's something called the Gelman Amnesia effect, which you can look it up, GELL-MANN. Actually, it's I don't probably, maybe there's no dash in it. I don't know. It's a guy's name is Murray Gelman. I think he was an Israeli mathematician. But the Gelman Amnesia effect is this. You read an article in the newspaper about something on which you are personally an expert or have direct firsthand knowledge, and you say to yourself, they got this totally wrong. This isn't how it happened. This isn't right. Then you turn the page and you read an article on something you know nothing about, and you immediately go, oh, this is amazing. This is accurate. We turn off our skepticism filter, even though the stuff we actually knew about was totally wrong. The things that we don't know about, we assume the media is gospel truth. So I'm as vulnerable as that as anyone. But the Wall Street Journal did this report on Singapore's manufacturing and how they've sort of reinvented manufacturing with robots and how it's becoming sort of a white-collar occupation there. There's not as many factories. I'm like, oh, this looks very interesting. But again, how accurate is it? I've been to Singapore in a while. I have been to Singapore, so I know a little bit about Singapore. But we gotta apply a little bit of skepticism to any foreign policy reporting. But I think when it's something where the U.S. government doesn't necessarily have a foreign policy stake, we might get a little better. But when it's something that involves people that we see as our friends or people that we perceive as enemies, the reporting is going to, by and large, reflect the position of the U.S. foreign policy and security establishment. We're going to see that when it comes to Taiwan. We're going to see that when it comes to China. We're going to see that when it comes to Burma. We're going to see that when it comes to Russia. We're going to see that, when it comes to Ukraine. We're going to see that when it comes to a lot of these different things. And again, in some cases, there's not total consensus in the government. In some cases, who knows what the U.S. government position vis-a-vis France is. So I'm not saying, we should be skeptical of every piece of reporting about France. There's a lot of places where it's not. But we should be deeply, deeply skeptical of any reporting about any issue or place overseas where there is a clear U.S. government stake or preferred outcome. We should assume that the media is going to be biased in favor of what the U.S. government wants. That's true whether there's a Democrat in power, or that's true whether there's a Republican in power, because these guys, by and large, agree on a lot of foreign policy. And so as we read about what's going on in Iran, read about what's going on in Ukraine, I might almost suggest why read about it, because I don't believe we're getting accurate picture. Now, again, let's just say the regime in Iran falls and there's freedom, then we can all celebrate that. Presumably, if the regime actually does fall, the reporting on that would be great. So I'm not saying that we should be indifferent to the outcomes there or that we shouldn't care about those people. But I am saying that what we're going to hear in the media is very likely going to be shaped by the U.S. government. For one thing, they sort of control the access. The foreign policy reporters are often, by and large, very aligned with them, etc. So apply deep, deep skepticism to any reporting that you hear about any country or foreign policy event where there is a substantial U.S. foreign policy, security, interest, and position in it. And I listed some of those, right? China, Taiwan, Burma, Russia, Ukraine right now are big ones. Could put Belarus in there, anything that's perceived to be a Russian satellite, Georgia, etc. You're going to see that it's going to replace it. So that's a way to think about it. Again, I can't necessarily recommend Herman and Chomsky, but you may want to buy it or check it out of the library and actually just read the very first section where it lays out their sort of propaganda model. And actually, you can probably find out everything you need to know about it on the news. People ask me all the time, Aaron, please recommend some books. Okay, tell me some books. And I just really have a hard time with that because so many of the books that I have read or that have influenced me in some way are only ambiguously recommendable, meaning that there's a lot of bad as well as good in there. I may not take it all in, or they're like super long, or they're wonky, or in some way there. So there aren't a lot of like short, very readable books to just tell the ordinary person, go read this book. It's awesome. There are a few. Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death, for example, is one that I would say go read it. Pretty short, easy to read, covers an important topic on the media. Charles Taylor's Secular Age, no. And I would probably put Manufacturing Consent as one of those. It's good to be familiar with the theory, but the actual book itself is probably just going to make your eyes glaze over. You may well abandon it justifiably in the middle. But anyhow, a few thoughts on foreign policy, and I will talk to you in the media, and I will talk to you next week.